the Environmental Commission meeting of Thursday, April 25th to order. Will you call roll?
Yeah, of course. Commissioner Graham, Commissioner Hutton, Commissioner Skinner,
Here.
Chair Needham, Council Member Smith,
Present.
Commissioner Slavic,
Here.
Commissioner Appel, Commissioner Gibb Randall,
Here.
Council Member Bannister,
Here.
Commissioner Collawart,
Here.
Commissioner Brown,
Here.
and then Commissioner Mursky. We have quorum.
All right. Any changes to the agenda we have in front of us for tonight? Additions?
No. I move to approve the agenda.
I second.
Do I have to repeat the names? Okay. All right. All in favor of approving tonight's agenda?
Aye.
Aye.
Opposed? All right, the agenda is approved. Next, we have the approval of the minutes from our March meeting that I believe were sent via email. Do I have a motion to approve the minutes?
Oh,
Second?
oh, wait, no, I had a comment.
Oh,
Just
Okay.
a possible correction. In the minutes, it just talks about DTE's contributions, but I wanted to just insert before contributions, this is the Energy Commission report, just say political or campaign contributions, to distinguish it from charitable contributions or others, just to make it clear, given the little context that's there.
I would second that amendment.
All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? All right, the minutes from our last meeting are approved. Do we have anyone here tonight for public commentary? No one? All right, there will be another opportunity at the end of the meeting if you would wish to stay. Is there any unfinished business? New business? All right, we'll get right in it then. First up, we have a funding presentation from City Administrator Lazarus.
Good evening. Thank you for the opportunity to talk about the FY20 budget, and also thank you for your continued service to our community. There is an accompanying resolution to this asking for you to provide a recommendation to the City Council as they take on the very serious business of approving next year's budget. A couple of disclaimers. As I was saying before the meeting, the slides didn't necessarily translate stylistically from a PowerPoint to a PDF, so I blame Josh entirely for that. I take no ownership. And unlike many presentations that are triumphs of style over substance, this is a triumph of substance over style. I'm also a little bit nervous because my mentor and coach during my community engagement training is sitting right behind me, and I will probably violate every rule that he taught me. So tonight, what I'd like to do is give you an overview of the budget, starting with the numbers. And some of the things didn't translate well here, but essentially, total expenditures for next year are $430 million. It's somewhere around an 8% increase over the previous year, and $111.3 million of that goes to the general fund, and you can see the other distribution. At the end of the 2-year financial plan, our balances remain at the midpoint of the city's policy goals at about 17.5%. City policies are 15 to 20%. The general obligation bond rating is AA+. Some people would ask, why don't you have a AAA bond rating? And the answer really is the requirements you need to achieve a AAA bond rating aren't really worth the reservation of funds, and the interest rates we get are as competitive as AAA ratings. So that's why it's AA+. The impacts to the residential taxpayer, which we're always mindful of and sensitive to, are about $11 a month between property taxes and the increases in utility costs. When we look at funding by priority, and these are in thousands of dollars, We tried to show on this slide the increase from the current FY19 to FY20. The increases by dollar amount and percentage for areas of both council and community and commission interest, starting with climate action and sustainability. And you can see there's $1 million increase or so, 358% in our climate action and sustainability funding. Also of interest is the large amount percentage increase dedicated to community mental health, as well as affordable housing. Those are areas that are of great interest to council, reflective of our community values, and those went up percentage-wise and dollar-wise more than any other one. Some of you may say, why did the road funding essentially stay kind of flat? And the answer to that is most of the increase is in active transportation, ped and bicycle, which also addresses carbon reduction. The actual road construction was just a little bit of an increase. Most of the increase in our transportation budget is for alternative means of transportation. When you look at new funding in the budget, we're talking about almost $4.3 million in new funds. The numbers there are additional funding beyond what's already in the budget, and they reflect a couple of council priorities. One is to be reflective of the community surveys that we've done. The other is to remain true to the allocation of county millage rebate funds. So you can see that of the new funding, $2.2 million comes from the county millage rebate, about $1.9 million comes from other general fund sources, including additional income due to development projects. There's a rebate in there from the city's risk fund. Because of the efforts we've taken through our wellness program and our safety program, our risk fund was overfunded. $4 million was sent back to the contributing funds, half of which is the general fund, about $2 million. It's a little, and some of the things that happened, we haven't had a increase in medical care for a while to the employee, and a lot of that has to do to reduced exposures, reduced long-term illnesses, partially due to our wellness program. We also, over the last couple of years, have had a 50% reduction in accidents in our public works area due to our safety program. So those are all, I think, very good news stories. What you see in there, safe drinking water, water and wastewater, most of that goes to funding upcoming requirements to the Barton and Superior dams that are required under FERC. In fact, somewhere between 35 and 40% of that new funding actually goes into dedicated reserve accounts. So we're really not spending it. We're building up monies for future obligations. For the Barton and Superior dams, we know we have about a $2.2 million general fund obligation starting in FY22, so we want to put the money aside now. Community mental health, the $349,800, $300,000 of that goes to the Housing Commission to provide supportive services. Half of the remainder goes to the police department for social services and for items that were brought up during the police task force that deal with interactions and community outreach. The other half goes to a employment jobs program that we have we are proposing with the neutral zone to engage youth in jobs. I was watching one of the presidential candidates who mentioned that when young people get employment between the ages of 17 and 19, their chances for long-term success are much greater. So we're going to work with the neutral zone on that. Going down the list, you can see the application to affordable housing. $220,000 of that goes towards supportive services to complement the $300,000 in mental health. The rest goes into the Affordable Housing Trust Fund. Police funding, among other things, includes 2 police cadets. There's 2 main purposes in creating police cadet positions. One is to provide the opportunity to put police cadets in administrative jobs, thereby letting warranted uniformed police officers to be out on the streets. So it's the cheapest way to add police. But the main reason in the cadet program, both police and fire, is to find a way to expand our recruiting efforts to reach out to young men, young women who might not consider public safety careers but for this exposure. And it gives us a meaningful way to expand the diversity of our recruiting efforts as well. I will talk about climate action in a little bit more detail. The pedestrian safety projects include $140,000 from the street millage specifically for the Fuller Road crosswalk over by Huron High School. So that's kind of a little bit of detail of where the $4.3 million goes. There's been a lot of talk about performance measures, and while the budget book has had performance measures for many years, they've changed over the last 3 years to be more quantitative, and we focus on where does the data come from, what's the math, because those performance measures should be both reliable and reproducible. And we are going to start posting those on the city's website, starting with the fourth quarter FY19 end of year, and they will be updated every quarter to provide greater insight into the internal measures we use to measure how well we're doing. We're also developing a set of key performance measures, it should be KPI, key performance indicators, that'll be presented in storyboard format. The police and fire are already on our website, as are the community. We're working on the community services. The financial are posted, and the last that you'll see roll out are the public services. They're updated as the data comes in, kind of auto-magically, so I like to say, and they'll be grouped together so that the public can answer the question, how do we know you're doing a good job? And they'll be presented in a way that they're current and they're easy to understand. And the representative example you see to the right is the police department. So we're excited about being able to share the story and be much more responsive to the people who pay the bills. The next series of slides breaks every rule that Charlie told me about slides, but I'm going to do it anyway. And it kind of provides a path of where the new funding goes and what we're using it for. On the drinking water and sewer infrastructure, we combined those two that were in the citizen survey. The total is about $574,000, and that's the money we're putting aside for outstanding obligations we know we have on the Barton and Superior dams. The reason that's a general fund obligation is several years ago, 2008, 2009, the responsibility for the hydro plants, along with the reserve accounts, went from the water utility to the general fund, and some of that money was used for other purposes. So the general fund now has the obligation but no funding, so we need to build the funding back up. And that really does address the hydropower portion of the dams. Each one of those flow charts also comes with a background, and this breaks every rule for PowerPoint that there are way too many words, but it's provided really for your reference instead of really for discussion. What I will focus on as we go through these really are what are the outcomes we hope to achieve. And I mentioned before, these are required to meet water supply, hydropower, and FERC requirements. The next one are climate action. And at Mr. Mirsky's suggestion, we added the green boxes to these because many of these funds, while they are put in the Office of Sustainability and Innovation so we can track them and provide transparency, they do go to support work from other agencies. And you can see how they're split there among the different agencies. And I'll touch on each one of those lightly as I go through the next set of slides. So the net zero affordable housing, we are going to put $200,000 aside to help fund net zero affordable housing. Council this past year approved a similar allocation for the Broadway apartments that the Housing Commission has. And the goal is to bring down, not only reduce our carbon emissions, but bring down the monthly cost of living for the residents in our affordable housing units. The outcomes you can see are that all affordable housing complexes and units will be energy positive or neutral by 2035. Next one is the Sustaining Ann Arbor Together Community Micro Grant Program. The requirement for a micro grant program is buried deep within the pages of the Climate Action Program. The goal here is also multifold. One is to do things in and around the community to promote awareness, but it's also really about building relationships in the neighborhood network so that people working together on a project get to know each other and it builds strength in our neighborhoods. This past year, we awarded our first projects. One was a project in the 5th Ward to promote compost collection. There was an award to the Northside STEAM School for their solar energy program. Ms. Bannister was there for the award of that. She was also there for the award about 2 weeks ago for a sustainability-themed playground up at the Leslie Science Center. That one of the goals also is to leverage other money. Partners from Toyota were there, and they're also contributing a significant amount of money to that project. A couple things in the pipeline are another sustainability themed playground at Burns Park, and there's also another solar curriculum at Burns Middle School, elementary. Elementary. And then there's some others that are coming, so we're excited about all of those. And these programs, my experience with these neighborhood partnering programs is that they do take a while to take off, but once they become wildly popular, the neighborhoods get engaged, and council generally supports them because it does build that trust between citizens and their government. 100% clean and renewable energy for municipal operations. Our goal, per the council's approved policy, is to be totally on clean and renewable by 2035. And the goals for the coming year are to complete energy audits for our 10 largest facilities, the Wheeler Center, the water treatment plant, wastewater, and then in FY21 to install energy improvements at 5 of them. And then the conversion, again, is to convert our energy use to renewable sources, and we will track that annually. The Revolving Energy Fund, the purpose is an internal account to pay for the upfront cost of energy efficiency and renewable energy improvements. And then it gets paid back through energy savings. So it's a way to overcome the fact that different city agencies don't always have funding in their budget to get over the hump. This is sort of the catalyst that helps us all get to a renewable source of energy. So again, the goal is to have a minimum of 15% by 2025. I have reason to suspect that Dr. Stoltz and her crew of outlaws will get us to 100% renewable much faster than the city's goal. So, and Josh will be put on the spot tonight. Some other programs, you can see there are a host of them. It's green housing rental, resiliency hubs, time of marketing, green buildings, aging in place. And I'll go through each one of those briefly as well. Green rental housing. Our goal is to have a rental efficiency standard established by the end of next year, the ordinance in place by the end of FY22, and then get to the point where there's no net increase in rents as the rental units become energy efficient. Resiliency hubs or resilience hubs is something that Dr. Stoltz is a champion for. The goal is to have the first hub designed in the coming year and then start the implementation in the second year of the financial plan. So there's also a goal to have residents have emergency preparedness kits by the end of FY21. Time of marketing addresses the fact that when you sell your home or you buy a home, you should disclose the home energy score when the home is up for sale, so you'll know what the financial costs are for living in a given home. And therefore, buyers can make more informed decisions about whether or not a home is a good fit for them. The goals are to create the time of marketing awareness ordinance in the coming year and then implement it in 2021 and beyond. Green Business Challenge, I think, revives a program that used to exist in town. The idea is to encourage and recognize business for engaging in more sustainable behaviors. And we hope by the end of FY21 that the program has been designed in partnership with our business community and that we get 50 businesses to participate by 2025. Aging in place efficiently, when you look at the demographics of our city, we have a lot of young people, we have a lot of people who are a little bit older. Our goal is to be able to help seniors stay in their homes. Part of that is a reduction in their energy cost. So the program has a goal of 15% reduction in energy usage in 21 low-income senior homes by 2021. Weatherization Expansion, we want to expand the initiative for Ann Arbor residents and have 12 homes weatherized through this expansion by the end of 2020. Efficiency and solar in the community. We could spend a lot of time talking about this. Again, Dr. Stoltz, Josh, Emily are working on some initiatives that I think Dr. Stoltz will lay out next month when she has the work session with council and presents her work plan. So I don't want to steal any of the thunder, but there are some very, very aggressive elements of that program to move our whole community to energy efficiency within the near term. So I will just whet your appetites on that and have you tune in on May 13th. Some other items of interest before I close. I know you're going to talk about solid waste this evening. We are near completion of the solid waste resource management plan. We are finalizing the job description for the resource recovery manager, and we'll go out to recruit that. That position is fully funded in the FY20 budget. And one thing that council has asked us to kind of look at after the resource management plan done is our participation in a regional solid waste management authority, which is being formed now. So it's something that we'll look at really towards the end of the first quarter of the fiscal year, after everyone in the community has had a chance to digest the resource management plan. Some water quality issues. Brian Steglitz has done an exceptional job in dealing with PFAS and in 1,4-dioxane. We are publishing our results now for PFAS bi-monthly, and we're doing it on our website. We've launched a new community information program so that people feel comfortable. You know, everything in Michigan now as it relates to water quality is viewed through the lens of what happened in Flint. We want to make sure that customer and consumer confidence in our safe and clean and reliable source of drinking water remains high. Council will continue to discuss water rates. They'll have a discussion next week as part of the budget adoption. We'll probably continue to look at the structure of the rates into next year. Lead and copper rule impacts require us to do an inventory of all the galvanized fittings in the city, and we'll do that. Although we're not required to make changes, and there are still some legal challenges to the lead and copper rule, as we go and do our street improvement programs, if we know there's a galvanized connection, we'll replace it. And in next year's budget, there's also the completion of the sanitary sewer evaluation and putting in periodic cleaning as a result of that. So the occasional sewage spills that you hear about should become a thing of the past. On the transportation side, DDA in partnership with the city will put in the city, and I hear the state's first, two-way cycle track on a two-lane roadway this summer, going from Ashley along William up to the Diag, and it'll be a protected and buffered lane, so we're excited about that. There's some discussion about lane reductions. You know, they're very much context sensitive, and they require a tremendous amount of outreach and good discussions with council so that they are comfortable with the balance between reducing lane widths, and not lane widths, but number of lanes, to make the crossing distance shorter, but also making sure that we don't introduce additional idling time by increasing congestion. So that continues to go on. We have all the easements we need for the Allen Creek berm opening project. We have the contracts in place. Construction should start midsummer, so hopefully we'll get our council members out there with the gold shovels and have the groundbreaking on a much awaited project. It will provide a safe way to get underneath the railroad tracks, and will be part of the tree line trail, which is the last item, where we are very close to having the easements, the right-of-way, and the things we need to lead from the border-to-border trail at the Huron River all the way up to, actually all the way through the on-road segments that lead us down to State and Stimson. So the commitment that staff made was that the tree line trail master plan was not going to be a document that sat on the bookshelf and gathered dust. We were actually going to do it, and you'll see the first part of it this summer when we start opening up pedestrian access, bike access through Allen Creek, the Allen Creek berm. So there's a lot of exciting stuff. In case you can't tell, this is an engineer being excited. And with that, I hope that you'll offer your support to the budget, and I'm here to answer any questions you may have. Yes.
I'm curious about the dams. Being on Planning Commission, we just heard about the whole DEQ site, not DEQ, sorry, DTE site on Broadway.
Sure.
And obviously, that is contingent upon Argo remaining extremely stable. Otherwise, it's all underwater. And so I'm just wondering, has Argo been recently redone enough that it's not in your immediate plans? Or the question came up in terms of the I don't think anyone is saying, oh my God, we can't do this because of the dam, but it came up as an issue, so I'm just curious in the scheme of things where Argo rates compared to the other dams in terms of maintenance.
The financing of that site development is complicated and involves a lot of give and take. Part of the community benefit that is in place for the planned unit development, the PUD application, includes repair and renovation of the Argo Dam,
Okay.
including actually another crossing across the river there. One of the goals of that is to provide a way to get across so that we can provide parking on the old Mishcon site. And I'm sure Ms. Bannister will be glad to know that will, by intent, will relieve some of the parking concerns in the Argo neighborhood.
So it's on their dime, in other words.
It's part of the agreement that we have with the whole, the Brownfield TIF
Okay.
and the PUD. But it is their contribution
Okay.
in the short term.
All righty, thanks.
Thank you for the detailed information that you provided. I'm wondering if you could help me understand the difference in the total budget expenditures on page 2, which you've expressed as 430 million, and the total funding by priority, which is slightly less than 200 million on slide 3.
What's on slide 3 is not all-inclusive. This is a snapshot of those priorities. It doesn't address ongoing operations and maintenance. It doesn't cost all of our pension costs. It doesn't include some of the personnel costs. It doesn't include all the ongoing public safety issues. What I have done there is selectively pulled out things that I thought would be of interest.
Any other questions?
Well, thank you all again for giving me the opportunity to come speak to you, and I hope you view this favorably. So, thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. All right, next up, we have a presentation on the solid waste regional,
Resolution.
what did I miss? Oh, sorry, missed the resolution. We have a resolution to support the proposed fiscal year 2020 City of Ann Arbor municipal budget process. Does someone need to introduce it?
Yep, so I'll introduce this, and I'll introduce it by reading it for everybody at home and in the audience that doesn't have a copy in front of them. It's attached in Legistar to the agenda. It's a resolution to support the proposed fiscal year 2020 City of Ann Arbor municipal budget process. Whereas the Environmental Commission received a presentation about climate and sustainability-related elements of the proposed fiscal year 2020 budget on April 25th, 2019. Whereas the budget includes funding to support projects and programs that will benefit city and community facing climate and sustainability programs throughout the city. And whereas the City of Ann Arbor has established a goal of reducing community-wide greenhouse gas emissions by 25% by 2025 and 90% by 2050, based on emissions baseline year of 2000. And whereas the City of Ann Arbor has established a goal of powering municipal operations with 100% clean and renewable energy by 2035, again based on emissions of the year 2000. Resolved, the Environmental Commission endorses the climate and sustainability-related elements of the proposed fiscal year 2020 budget moving forward through the budget process.
Do you want to motion to approve?
Somebody's got to second that.
Okay. Do I have a second? All right.
2 seconds.
2 seconds.
Then discussion.
Any discussion on the resolution that Councilmember Smith has read? Okay. All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? All right, the resolution passes, is approved. Okay, now the next item on the agenda is the
I realize
present-
you were just excited about it.
I know, I'm so excited. I can't wait for this presentation. The Solid Waste Regional Management Plan update from Mr. Slotin.
push the button. Thank you, Environmental Commission. I'm Crescent Slatton with the Public Services area. One of my roles these days is the manager for our Solid Waste Resources Management Plan. And so here with other team members, just a quick introduction, Christina Siebert is our lead consultant project manager for Aptum. And Charlie Fleetum, who you sort of heard about, our key facilitator and community engagement sub-consultant. And also Molly Maciejewski, who I've gotten really good at pronouncing that last name and almost can spell it by memory, is our public works manager and another key member of our team. And so we're going to give an update and status and provide details on some of the key aspects of the project that have been completed or are underway. And I'm going to be turning over to Christina here shortly to go through most of those details. And we'll also be looking for some feedback from the commission on actually a particular aspect of that, which Christina's going to get in the details, but basically the initial options and things that we're looking at as part of the project to look at program enhancements or additions potentially. So, but before I even start on the presentation itself on the project, I just wanted to pause because I had an email request from Commissioner Mursky, who couldn't be here tonight but wanted me to pass along an update or actually answer to a question that was asked Tuesday at our third advisory committee meeting, which you'll hear a bit more about later. But besides the additional agenda, one of the committee members asked if a question could be answered about heard about a proposal from Recycle Ann Arbor related to our MRF, and so asked for an update or a response to that. And so I provided that at the meeting, and Commissioner Mursky just wanted me to pass that on to the commission as well. And so that update was that city has been approached by Recycle Ann Arbor about the potential for, they've termed it a mini MRF, with some description, narrative description of what that might be. But doesn't have a full detail of a proposal, so some key differences in terms of a discussion topic or initiation, but not a detailed proposal yet. So we've provided feedback to Recycle Ann Arbor as to what are the key pieces and the details that would be needed to really develop an actual proposal for the city to react to. And so that's been provided to them, and really is waiting to see when and if that comes back. And so if that comes back, then staff would review and evaluate that and react and respond to that. And a key question will be if that's something that we could move forward with based on them coming into us, or would that be something through our policies and procurement requirements really need to be through a broader request for proposal. So, so we've been approached. It's not complete and detailed yet, but if that happens, we'll see where the next step is. And so that was provided to the committee on Tuesday. Okay. So with that, I will begin just initially to
I
kind of
have a
set the
question
stage.
about, I'm sorry,
Yep.
I have a question about that.
Yep.
My understanding is that this proposal, which I've only heard rumors about, needs some timely communication from the city staff. So I'm hoping that, I think many of us that are aware of this are hoping that the city staff can respond to the proposal quickly enough to get the benefits, some of the benefits that are part of the package.
And it's my understanding that Recycle Ann Arbor has just delivered the 4th revision of the proposal right before this meeting today.
I received an email from Brian about 5:19 this evening, so I haven't had a chance to open it yet. To be really open and honest, where we are is we're going from agreeing on good intentions to getting into the nitty-gritty of what an agreement would look like. We need to make sure that when we present something that amounts to an unsolicited sole source procurement to council, that we're comfortable with the value that it provides and with the certainty and assurances that it provides. And that includes, the goodwill that Recycle Ann Arbor has as a valuable community member, but ultimately council's going to be looking at a pretty high dollar value contract that could be awarded without competition. And we need to be comfortable with it so that they can debate it earnestly on behalf of the public.
No, of course, we all appreciate that.
And we
We're
will,
just-
we will move with due speed and to get it before council as we can. I'm aware of the sensitivities and the needs they have from a contracting standpoint, so we'll look at it as quickly as we diligently can.
Okay, because just a final comment that it has been almost 3 years since the MRF closed. You know,
Yes.
And so I think we've all been hoping that the MRF would get restarted pretty soon.
And I appreciate that and sensitive to it. From a time perspective, the very first thing I did when I started as city administrator, even the day I walked in almost, was to take the difficult challenge of shutting down the MRF. And while the path has been a little bit rocky to get to where we are, I'm hopeful that the proposal will set us in good stead for many, many years to come, recognizing the changes that have occurred in the recycling industry. And I think I share your pain.
Thank you, Howard. Okay. Okay. In terms of the Solid Waste Resources Management Plan, I actually brought back a infographic that shared with the commission and with various stakeholders to really show our process, and been updated with the progress of what's been done. And won't go through it necessarily step by step, but some of the key items that have been accomplished and completed noted there on the slide, as far as looking more detailed at our tonnages and diversion quantities, the recent past, benchmarking with other communities. Christina's definitely going to get into some information with cost of service analysis, which reminds me, and I'm sure Christina will mention too, along with this PowerPoint, a lot of other added items in the packet. We're not going to pull them up and go through them, but there are slides related to some of those things. So at the conclusion and after the feedback discussion on the options, if there's still time and a desire, we can pull up some of those, because we have those on the flash drive as well, some of those supporting documents. And a key part with any project in the city of Ann Arbor, but particularly this one, public engagement. I've mentioned we had an advisory committee meeting this past Tuesday. That was the third meeting of that committee, my small committee of 50, as I like to say. And we have one more meeting. We'll hear about it at the end as we talk about next steps. And another key piece of the engagement too that has been completed, and again you'll hear about in a little bit, our resident survey, which was a key task of the project. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Christina Siebert to walk us through some of those key aspects of the project.
Good evening, everyone. It's good to be back in front of you. We've covered a lot of ground since we were here last for the visioning session, work session that we had in August. So tonight, really, we're going to go over 3 of the big areas that we've either completed or have nearly completed. The first being the preliminary options. We want to start there because I think it'll help you to frame your thinking as we go through some of the other pieces, those being the cost of service, what do things cost now and where do the dollars reside? And as the final piece being the resident survey and what we've heard from the residents as far as the interests they have and the satisfaction they have with current services as well. So we're going to start with the preliminary options. We have about 14 options, I think, that we're going to talk through. And so given the amount of options there are and the time that I want to allow for you to ask the questions that are important to you, I'm not going to cover them all in detail. But there is in your packet a document that has one-page summaries of each of those different options. So I encourage you to look at those. And if you have questions or you have feedback on that after the meeting tonight even, we're available to take written comment from you or written feedback so that we can be sure that that is taken into account as we start to formulate draft recommendations that the advisory committee will be commenting on and that we'll be asking for your support for as we draft that plan. How have we identified our options? At this point, we've taken the feedback from our stakeholder interviews, which we did more than 30 of at the beginning of the process, the downtown business focus group, other discussions that we've had with city staff and other parties around the city, and supplemented all of that with the best practices that we see implemented in other communities that are either achieving high diversion or are making strides towards a high diversion rate to see what those best in practice type options are. We've grouped those options into 3 different areas. We've got residentially focused options, We have commercially focused options, and then we have a set of options that are focused entirely on the downtown and alley serviced areas for improvements to that service. And when we looked at each of these options, we laid out what the current conditions and the potential future condition would be. We identified the benefits and the objectives that would be achieved by implementing those options. We have the diversion and cost impacts identified, and when we talk about those cost impacts, those are direct cost impacts to the city's solid waste fund. So it's the staff and the equipment and operations-related expense that would go along with that. What we haven't included at this point for those cost impacts are indirect costs that are the administrative charges that come back from other city departments, but that support the work of the solid waste group, as well as any financial adjustments that are applied against the fund annually for retirement benefits and pensions, things like that. So those will all be coming as we start to get into fund projections for these different options, but right now, all the costs you see, those are direct cost impacts. We've also looked at the resource needs in order to identify those cost impacts. So how many people would we need to be able to staff some of these options, and what is the equipment that we would need, or where would we need to possibly be procuring contracts for outside vendors to provide services. And then for each of these, we came up with a rating scale on different criteria that we thought would be important for being able to evaluate them against each other. In those rating criteria, we rated things on a low to high scale, looking at the level of effort to implement, the cost impact, the alignment with the city's zero waste vision, the greenhouse gas reduction potential of the option, and then the responsiveness to the input that we've heard from the public. Because in some cases, they're not entirely responsive to what we've heard from the public, but they're still best practice type options that we think would be of a benefit to the city. What you're not going to see in the options is funding options or ways to pay for the programs that we're talking about and the options that we're looking at. That's another next step to this process, is to identify how we cover those costs if there isn't enough money through the existing funding mechanisms. So do we need to look at adding a user fee? Is there any ability to increase the millage revenue that's coming in, or to reallocate the millage revenue to be able to pay certain portions of the costs and then introduce a blended type of funding with some user fees for certain types of services? All of that is still under evaluation and not something that we're ready to talk about at this point. The other things you won't see in these options are the MRF. And for part of the reason that we just heard about from Crescent and from Howard, is we have been aware that there was an idea from RAA to do something to restart that facility. We've been involved in looking at what has been proposed or has been discussed at this point. So we've been waiting to have more information to flesh that out and take that into consideration as part of this process. So hopefully now that sounds like maybe there's more information available, over the next couple of weeks we may have something more to think about on that. The other thing that we don't have in here is education and outreach on a broad scale. So the citywide type education and outreach that we would be recommending or suggesting could be implemented to provide more information to residents and more outreach to the residents and businesses to drive more of their diversion habits, drive more of their attitudes and behaviors in how they select what they purchase, whether they can be influenced to do more in terms of reduction and reuse. All of those different types of efforts are something that we're going to be bringing back to you, but taking into account what the options are for potential future implementation as well, so that we can kind of build all of the needs together. But within each of the different options that we have identified, we have added in costs and staff effort for some outreach to support that in an implementation sense, and focused particularly to those programs. So it's somewhat there, but we also are envisioning a larger outreach program as a recommendation ultimately in this plan. So I'm just going to list through the different options in the residential sector and share with you what the feedback is that we heard from the advisory committee. We'll do the same thing with the commercial and the downtown options without really going into much in the explanation of this. So I apologize if I know that you haven't had the materials for very long. If you haven't had a chance to read the detail on them, I will be happy at the conclusion of the presentation to go back to any of them that you want to talk about. But on the residential side, we looked at year-round residential compost collection and have two different costs in there, one based on a biweekly collection and one based on a monthly collection. That's an expansion on work that was done for the organics management plan a couple of years ago. We have an option for curbside textile collection, which is actually a virtually free program to the city. It's a no-cost contract that we would be looking at, and it has revenue-generating potential as well for the textiles that would be collected. We looked at a bulky waste collection option to provide collection of bulky items on a periodic basis through the city for the residential sector. And then electronic waste and household hazardous waste collection also is an item that we looked at to supplement the existing drop-off options that are available for those materials. So what did we hear from the advisory committee on these different items? There was definitely strong support for the year-round residential compost collection. Really, the only concern that we heard raised on that was the concern that material may freeze in the bottom of carts and be difficult to collect. So there would be an outreach element that goes along with this and an education element to help residents understand how best to get around that challenge, and knowing that that will perpetually be an issue regardless of how we would implement a year-round collection because of our winter climate here. Curbside textile collection had very broad support as well. There were some questions from the committee about what the contractor does with the material that's collected, how much of it gets reused, how much of it's recycled, where is it going to. The bulky waste collection had mixed support, and in fact there was probably the most concern on this particular topic, just from an ability to manage the residents and how they set material out, what type of material they set out, how specific the program would have to be to make sure that there isn't abuse of the service, and therefore leading to a very high cost to the service that the city wouldn't have been prepared for. Also, the observation that people have done a very good job of figuring out ways to get rid of their bulky items since the city discontinued its bulky item collection several years ago, and that was a conscious decision by the city to discontinue that at that point. On the e-waste and HHW collection, again, there was mixed support. Some people felt that it wouldn't necessarily be needed because there are drop-off options. You can go to the county's toxics facility, you can take some materials to the drop-off station, and that the survey that we did showed that residents actually are using those facilities for a lot of materials. But there is still a portion of the population that won't use those or doesn't use those or may not have the access to get to the facilities, or has a larger TV that doesn't fit in their vehicle. There's a lot of different reasons that an at-home collection could make sense. But again, there were concerns and questions raised about the risks and the liability associated with that, setting household toxics out in front of your house for pickup and leaving them until your pickup occurs. That day of collection was viewed as a risk. And then the cost associated with the quantity of material that may be collected was also a concern.
Can I ask a question? Could you go back and explain the rating scale in terms of high, medium, low, what that's actually
Yeah, so
providing?
so the high, medium, and low, in some cases, high is going to be favorable, and in some cases, high will be not favorable. So when you look at things like direct cost, a high rating means high cost. If you're looking at greenhouse gas reduction, the high rating means we're going to be achieving greater reduction of greenhouse gases for those options relative to some of the medium or low options. So this was really, we used it as a way of just providing an across-the-board comparison of the different options. I think ultimately we will look at doing something on like a 1, 2, 3 scale or a favored to non-favored scale. But for simplicity at the time that it was coming together, we went with the high, medium, and low.
I just find it a bit confusing.
Yep, especially when we start putting colors to it and it looks, that's got the stoplight,
And if
red
they
meat
have
usually
two
means
different
stop or,
meanings, yeah.
right,
High can be
right. So
good
they're
and
they're
bad,
kind of, yeah, you have to put a little more thought into that as you see them together, that we're not necessarily looking for the option that has the highs all across the
All
board or the
green.
lows all across the board.
Thanks.
So, thank you. Yeah, it will be getting updated as we get it further into the rating and the ranking type process.
I have one more question. Are textiles accepted at the drop-off station?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, and they do take a fair amount. So, and the textile program that we're looking at, there's a company called Simple Recycling that operates in this market. They also operate in probably I think there are around 300 communities nationwide, but they have 26 communities in the Detroit metro market, including City of Saline and City of Ypsilanti here in Washtenaw County, that they serve. It's a no-cost program. They provide bags. The material gets picked up on your regular day of collection, and they actually encourage people to still use donation outlets and other charitable organizations for material if that's how they've historically handled getting rid of that material. They're trying to provide the service to that portion of the population that is looking for the easiest option to get rid of material. Something else that I personally like about it, I don't donate items that are like, ripped jeans or clothing that's stained that I believe is just going to be a waste for someone else to deal with. They will actually take those materials because they have recycling options for those portions of the textiles without being a burden on the charitable organization or donation organization that you might otherwise send it to. And they also are not a charity, so you cannot do it as a tax deduction. But their website has all kinds of great information about what they do with the material they collect, and how they encourage you to still use your other local outlets.
And one more time, the name of the company is
Simple Recycling.
Simple Recycling. Thank you.
Yep. So we've got a graph here that just provides a comparison of costs. So we have two different types of costs that we're showing. The bars are showing the annual direct costs. So we have a range of costs for many of these different options, being a high and a low. And then the green bars we use to show kind of a cost per ton on a low and a high basis. You'll see with bulky waste that there isn't a range shown. That's because the way that calculation worked out, it actually netted out to the same cost per ton, even in a high and a low scenario, because the cost doubled, but the tonnage also doubled, so it just washed. And it was basically coincidental that those two things both were multipliers of each other. So this is just another way of, again, relatively comparing those costs. So on the commercial side, we had 5 different options. One is for fats, oils, and grease management, and this would be focused primarily to the yellow grease component of restaurant grease. This is the grease that goes into the collection bins that are out in the alleys or behind restaurants a lot of times. It comes out of the fryers. It's not the brown grease that would come out of the grease trap that you also have to manage as a restaurant. But the city doesn't have a lot of mechanisms to really track the behavior of restaurants around the grease now, and it creates issues, especially in the alleys. So we're looking at an ordinance option for that to improve those conditions. Commercial organics collection is something that we have visited before as part of the organics management plan, so we've updated that option. And there's a lot of interest in that, particularly focused to the food generating businesses. While there might be some non-food generators that would be interested, the impact is going to be greatest with the restaurants, with the grocery stores. Student move-in and move-out collection as kind of an adjunct to a bulky item collection program would provide a higher level of service during that move-in, move-out period. On construction and demolition waste, again, it's an ordinance and a permit type of option. Looking at how we can drive the diversion of building-related construction and demolition material. So not all of the C&D stream, a significant portion of the C&D stream is from road construction projects. We wouldn't be looking at touching that. That material is almost universally recycled already, never enters our usual handling system. But the building-related C&D is something that the city never has really interacted with. It's not part of its commercial franchise. So as a way of being able to drive diversion of that material, which with the building and redevelopment happening in lots of parts of the city, is probably pretty sizable. We'd be looking at a permit requirement to develop a diversion plan and provide disposition information for those materials and phase that in over time. And our last option there is the commercial services participation enforcement, which is just really a long way of saying making people follow the ordinance that exists now. Commercial businesses are required to have trash collection and subscribe to that service either through the city or through waste management in the franchise. And they're also required to recycle. The way those ordinances are structured and with the staffing that's available, it hasn't been enforced very well or very much at all. And there are 350 to 500 businesses that are known to be not complying with that ordinance. So this effort would include a lot of face-to-face work with those businesses, making sure that they're aware of the requirements, and then also helping them to implement the programs on site that would allow them to participate in the recycling program and actually divert material. So the advisory committee liked the fats, oils, and grease option. Didn't really see too many concerns with it. On the commercial organics collection, also, there was a strong support for that, particularly focused towards those larger food-oriented businesses, provided that there was space for the containers and there was the right amount of education that went along with setting those programs up. The student move-in and move-out collection had limited support. Several of the members of the committee questioned whether it was even needed because of the current services that are provided through contract with Recycle and Arbor for the temporary drop-off location that's set up during the peak move-out periods. The city also provides apartments with the option to call in and schedule a free pickup on 2 of the busy Mondays following the peak move-out period. So there are options already in place that are being provided to the apartment owners and to those residents. So there was concern about whether it was really something that needed to be done or not. And then also through those avenues, there's more potential that that material is getting diverted. The concern would be that if it was kind of a full-time, we'll pick up everything that's out there, there's not a real incentive to the residents or to those property owners to try to divert any of the reusable items like the furniture or houseware type items, which is actually being collected through that temporary drop-off that's being done. On C&D waste, that again was generally supported. Definitely was viewed that there is a need for more data to be available, which just isn't collected now, before setting any kind of an expectation for a diversion target that would be reasonable or appropriate to put onto the contractors or the property owners that are doing that development. But that we can start that through getting a permit requirement in there to actually collect the information, start building a database of understanding of what's there, and also starting to put the word out to the contractors or to the haulers that there's a need for some construction, demolition, recycling, processing infrastructure in the market, because there isn't a lot of that available right now. So before we can go in and say we must divert 50% of this, we really need facilities that are available to process the material that we would be asking to divert. And having that policy of diverting coming and knowing that it's going to be coming will help to drive that infrastructure. And then on the commercial services enforcement, there was definitely strong support for that. There was several questions that were raised about why the cost for that was higher than maybe had been expected. So if you look at the cost here, of the options, aside from the commercial organics collection, where we would roll that out to all businesses, the cost for that enforcement is fairly high, at about $1.1 million, $1.2 million a year. Part of that is that it's a very intensive effort to have to get in front of those businesses and work with them face-to-face, hand-in-hand, with repeated touches back to them to make sure that they're understanding the information, that you're getting the right person, that they're embracing the work, and actually doing what they're supposed to. The other portion of that is that we assumed that that would result in higher diversion, and we'd be shifting tons that currently are collected as trash over to collection as recycling. And when we get into the cost of service analysis, you'll see this better, but in broad terms, the cost to process recyclables is about 4 times as high as the cost to landfill a ton of trash. So moving that to a different bucket is just necessarily going to increase the cost. So for our downtown and alley operations, we looked at 4 different options or alternatives here. All of these are designed to give a higher level of service to the downtown. All of them are based on a 7-day collection operation, which we've heard from many of the stakeholders is needed, and what our research into what other communities do to serve their dense business districts is they all have 7-day collection. Or at the very least, maybe they don't have 1 day of collection during the week, but they have Saturday and Sunday collection. That's that peak period for a lot of your restaurants, your bars, your shops, and we need to make sure we can serve that. So the first option would be a 7-day collection with services basically as is right now. The businesses would still be able to select their container size. Everybody would have their own individual containers, but we would make it mandatory that restaurants and bars have Saturday and Sunday collection in the downtown. would also have 2 additional days of collection. So they would have a 4-day minimum collection with those 2 other days falling during the week. And by putting that as a mandatory service, we can shift work schedules with the collection crews to not make that an overtime collection during the weekends and try to keep those costs under control. The second option is to, again, do that 7-day collection, but instead of letting everyone pick their own container, we'll do an inventory of the entire downtown. What are the containers that are out there now? What are the collection frequencies? So what is the minimum level of capacity that's needed, knowing that we're going to be there every day picking it up? And where can we consolidate and place larger dumpsters and assign businesses that your dumpster now is located in this location? It will not be directly behind their business necessarily or right outside their door, but it will be available to them. And then the costs would be apportioned through a special assessment, similar to how costs are assigned through the BIZ, for the Main Street BIZ, for the services that they provide, in an effort to take away from the economic decision that businesses will make that they want to pay for the cheapest option available to them, even if it's not the appropriate option for what they need, and provide also the incentive to have fewer containers and provide them in areas that the city selects as being more effective for all of their different downtown operations. Alternative C is that same type of option as B, except that we would be installing underground refuse containers. So there would be a receptacle located at the top of the ground surface that looks like the picture in the left of that box for alternative C, kind of looks like a mailbox. And then there's a vault that's below ground that collects that waste. So we're providing the dumpster capacity without the same dumpster footprint or appearance. That does require a special piece of collection equipment. It's its own unique truck because it has a crane on it to lift it and drop into a top-loading truck. So there is a significant capital cost associated with that. The city of Kissimmee, Florida is using these. They have about 45 of them in place right now. They started initially with 18 and they've gone and expanded it. And there's several other communities in Florida that are looking to add to that. So we know it works in a warm climate. What we haven't tested is whether it works in a cold climate and what issues would we have during the winter. Are they going to get frozen into the ground? Will the material freeze in the container? So this would definitely be something to pilot and possibly do in a couple of areas, but it may not be a one-size-fits-all for the entire city, for the entire downtown. Alternate D is a bag-based collection program. So businesses would be purchasing bags for their trash and bags for their recycling, and they would set them out as they get filled, and we can provide a twice daily pickup through the alleys to remove the bags that are there. This is modeled off of a program in the city of Seattle called the Clear Alleys program, where they've implemented it in select areas. And in those areas, then, they pull the trash and recycling containers out entirely. Everything's in the bags. They do make exceptions to still allow carts for organics because they don't want to bag the organics for the mess, for the potential for tearing of the bags, things like that. So this again just shows the comparison
Just
of those.
quick question
sorry.
on that, back a slide. So in your comparison with Florida, another thing to take into consideration is just how those different communities handle their utilities in terms of where they run them. Because you could have that could be just a game stopper right there in terms of how those things are handled. So like in Detroit, where we do a lot of work, all the utilities run through the alleyways. It'd be a nightmare to put vaults in there.
Right.
And I'm not quite sure how it all works in the downtown, but that's just going to be a massive,
There is, and so
like
we've
a
worked.
first step.
We've built in the cost estimating for this, we've built in a cost for the engineering design for that, and it includes evaluating whether you can find suitable space and that you can confirm that utilities aren't present. So that would limit potentially the areas that you could situate these. They actually, if you look at the way that is situated in the picture, they're not even in an alley, they're on a street side. So it could actually be something that you could put on your, right on your sidewalks in certain areas and move it entirely out of the alleys. Obviously, there's still plenty of considerations to have with any obstructions both below ground and above ground in that collection and in that service, and then also making sure that everybody keeps things clean around the container. Lots of questions that would have to be answered there.
I have a
Yeah,
quick
Chip.
question on this, Christina. In looking at these 4 alley options, the one thing that I don't see is a discussion of, why don't we just punt this over to the biz to handle, you know? Because I know that the 3 associations have all gotten together and said, we want to tackle this. And, you know, honestly, Councilmember Bannister and I get an awful lot of emails about the alleys. And, you know, particularly as it heats up, we'll get more and more about how neighbors aren't getting along and all that. Frankly, this shouldn't be that, and you and I have had this discussion, it shouldn't be that complicated an issue, but we haven't been able to do anything about it. Let's hand this off to the people that are directly impacted it and let them manage it. I mean, this is a pass-through cost for us. I would appreciate that consideration to the proposal that is sitting out there from the 3 different associations in the DDA.
So Crescent and I did have a conversation with Ed Schafferin where he laid some of those options out for us. We intentionally did not go and call it something that we would dedicate to the biz at this point, because one of the other elements of our scope for this plan is to look at service delivery. So that does fit into that
Okay.
service delivery type of an option. So there are a lot of considerations that go into that kind of biz scenario, and legal considerations that we have to still work our way
Right.
through. So we are doing that.
I mean, I'd be much more interested in pursuing something like that than thinking about putting vaulted dumpsters in our alleys. It's not gonna solve our problem anytime soon, and this is one of these things that I would like to be solved sooner rather than later.
Understood. And our advisory committee agreed with you, because they said alternate A and alternate B all day long, and alternate C and alternate D, no thank you. So definitely an interest in getting that 7-day collection into the downtown, higher level of service being required for certain types of business, being, you know, the restaurants in particular, because they are more likely to generate that material that needs to get picked up on the weekends. And looking at the, you know, possibilities for that consolidated collection and how that might occur. So
Thank
you guys
you.
are in alignment.
And just more on that, I met with those guys too, and the State Street Area and the Main Street Area Association. I think when we say hand off to them, my understanding was that they wanted to pay extra. They were willing to have an additional special assessment to get the 7-day pickup. Yeah.
Yep, and that's what we've heard too, and that's where, you know, that question of how that special assessment gets applied and who's doing that application of that special assessment. Also bearing in mind any potential changes in who delivers services, to be consistent with council resolution about current provision of city services with city staff. So there are a lot of different moving pieces that certainly you guys can speak to better than I can, and how that is allowable. Or would be understood within the context of those parameters. So you can't read this very well up on this screen, but hopefully on a printed copy, or if you look at it on your computer screen, you might be able to see it better. We did go through and do a preliminary run through the sustainability framework goals, and how each of these options align with those goals, just because of the fact that that's a guiding document that you use as you make your decisions moving forward. So wanted you to have the chance to see where each of these options fit in those goals and which ones they achieve.
I did it, that was sort of one of my questions. Eventually, would we get some net, metrics on how much the impact of these were on the greenhouse gas emissions, particularly like the organics and the commercial services participation enforcement?
Yes, yeah, we'll be able to get those numbers. It would be a little premature before we get the feedback on the different options, and we'd be just duplicating the work if we keep going back and, you know, there's change because of the feedback that we hear from the advisory committee and from you all here tonight. Yeah, we didn't run those firm numbers, but in relative sense, we did look at it. So, yes, your long answer to a short question. All right, so we're going to shift gears and talk about our cost of service analysis and financial projections. There's a copy of the cost of service technical memorandum that was provided as part of your packet for tonight. I believe that you may have already had it as well, because I think it was attached as a response to some questions that were answered by staff back in maybe January or February. But you may not have looked at it at that point. So I want to just give the quick findings from that analysis, and then we're going to go into a couple of the items in more detail. High-level residential services are about $9.5 million per year. Commercial services cost the city about $6.3 million per year. And then there's some other services like the costs associated with the city's former landfill that are a small, less than $500,000 cost per year in fiscal year 18. Overall, residential services average about $29 per household per month. That's a standard metric that we use in the industry as we're comparing across different communities. It's a lot of the way that a private hauler would look at pricing a community is how many homes am I driving past and what is my cost to serve each home. And then that ties back to potential funding methods for collecting those fees is how much is the household costing the system. Looking to the big picture of funding sustainability, in fiscal year 18, revenues and operations expenses generally balanced. There was actually a slight revenue surplus. But there are annual equity adjustments that hit the solid waste fund for pensions and other employee costs that resulted in actually in a fund balance decrease during fiscal year 18. And that was just based on 1 year. And we know from looking at fiscal year 18 and changes that are happening this year that the operations expenses side of the equation is going up. That's in part due to the collections operations being more fully staffed. And in fact, I think they're now currently fully staffed or will be with hiring maybe one more person to replace those temporary employees that had been holding the vacated positions. So those costs for those employees are going to be higher for fiscal year 19 than they were in 18. The recycling markets continue to be depressed, so revenue that had been offsetting portions of the recycling processing cost continue to be down as well. So that means less revenue to offset the expense ends up being higher. So based on those insights and knowing that those costs are still very dynamic and very fluctuating with the recycling costs. We don't expect that current revenues are going to be sufficient in the long term to sustain current services. And if we're to add additional services to that, each of these different options we're looking at are incremental cost adds, not any kind of savings that we would get. So in order to be able to sustain the current services and add new programs, either some other expense needs to be decreased or revenue needs to be increased. So
I just wanted to say, and I know that this is not news to anyone here, but we are spending $20,000 to $30,000 a month for the past 3 years to ship our recyclables to Ohio. So if that problem is solved, that will be a significant savings, and that money can go toward expanding some of these programs.
It could. And so that kind of goes right into our financial model. So the next piece that we are working on, which will be coming yet, isn't here yet, is a near-term projection of fund balances, both under current conditions and then under different option scenarios, and based on the timing of implementation of different options, and being able to weigh the revenues, the expenses, the fund balance impacts of each of those, and gauge that impact that the options would have on the long-term picture. What that model won't be is it won't be a simulation type model. So it's not going to be a matter of we've got a dashboard and we can plug in a number here and a number here, and it does its magic and it spits out a new fund balance at the back end. There's a lot of analytical thought that needs to go into each of the different scenarios and how they roll through those different cost centers and what the fund balance impacts are. So the tool that we'll have will be usable by staff to be able to do that as time passes and costs change and we see changes in staffing or implementation of new programs, and we can gauge what shift in the amount diverted would be. We can gauge what the impact would be if we were to have a lower processing cost for recyclables versus current costs, and whether it's enough of an impact to offset those differentials and return us back to a positive fund trend. And I think Crescent's going to come up and talk briefly now about the model.
I'm going to jump in on this one because this has already proven to be so valuable from my perspective, from staff's perspective, in and Christina touched on it already quickly, with that dollar amount of that cost per household. As I think you have learned along with me and staff, our system is very complex in how all of our materials are managed and the different players and the different pieces and components. And so we now are able to, and Christina is going to walk you through here very shortly, the output as to what are those true costs by stream. What is it for our trash, for our recycling, for our compost, at a residential unit level, so that we can understand what are those differences. And then, again, as we go forward, using the model as it's developed, both to generate the recommendations and to see what those impacts are, but then also down toward the bottom here on this slide, going forward, this is, again, tool we're looking for that's included in the contract, that as we monitor and implement the programs, and then even look for further, it's still going to be of that key tool used, as Christina described, for us to evaluate and understand as they get implemented, and as our system changes. As the diversion changes, there's actual financial impacts to that, and we'll be able to adjust and understand that. So I wanted to put that plug in, and I'm going to turn it right back to
Okay.
Christina.
I have a question about that.
Yep.
Because, I mean, I remember a long time ago looking at the final estimates for the solid fund balance and the annual costs year to year. There were significant multi-million hits to the budget every year. So there were very wild fluctuations. And they seem to be coming from outside of any of the standard normal operations. So, and they were hard to understand from the brief, 3-4 word description that were ascribed to them. So what's the assurance that in the future that these sort of hits will become more predictable and more manageable?
Well, there's always the potential for the unknown hits, the types of adjustments that Christina mentioned. Biggest one mentioned GASB or new accounting procedures that come out. But some of those, as we understand and they get more consistent, some of the other offsets that are in there are depreciation of our equipment. That's back to an item with the MRF, that because we're the owner of the MRF and that's our equipment, we're actually still depreciating that equipment, that building, and those are hits to the fund. Those aren't operating expenses, but those are the adjustments that are made outside, and those are predicted and understood. But that's some of these other things as accounting procedures and some of the financial adjustments. We make our best estimates, and so I can't guarantee that we're always going to have it absolutely predictable, but we're going to better understand as we move forward where they are, but also, and as you'll see with the upcoming slides, where those hits are and how they're distributed as to where the material streams are. So if it's hitting in, say, trash, we can find what areas we could perhaps make some adjustments in, some look for cost savings in adjusting things.
What's the last number we have for the balance of the solid waste fund?
I want to say it's roughly $9.5 million.
Yeah. We can certainly go back and check, because it has been some time, Commissioner Skinner, but I'm sure we could get that, and Josh will hold me to making sure that gets out. Okay, so I'll turn it back over to Christina.
On the table of the summary of cost by function, there's a footnote for contract collections under cart recycling. What is that footnote for?
I'm sorry, Commissioner, which,
Just one more slide back.
one more slide back.
That one.
So- I'm sorry, which item?
It's under contracted collections, cart recycling. It's $1,736,689. There's a little footnote there.
When you go to the cost of service technical memorandum, that table is actually right out of that.
Okay.
So, yeah, I can pull it out. The footnote is in the table, in the
Okay.
document. So this
was a
table was
cool
here
graph.
for representative purposes
Got
of,
it.
we're going from this level of information to a projection. Yeah, and I could pull it out right now if you want me to answer it, or if we could look it up later.
Looking up later is fine.
Okay.
And I think that the screen that you were showing us, page 18, I don't have in my presentation.
So there was, you were correct. And in fact, some of the earlier slides where we showed the advisory committee feedback also weren't in your copy.
Right.
So this was added because of comments and questions that came from the advisory committee meeting that we had on Tuesday also. That meeting was held after everything was already posted to
Okay.
Legistar for this meeting. So
Okay.
a new version is going to be uploaded with all of the new slides in it.
Okay, great, thanks.
All right, so real quick on the methodology, we use the FY18 costs and operations data to be able to walk through the cost of service and realigned the different cost functions that the city tracks for its purposes and its budget to functional areas by the different cost elements, so that we could come up with that really small version of that table 3 that you saw there, where we actually show the cost for each of the different sectors, so residential waste, recycling, composting, commercial waste, commercial recycling, and what goes into each of those different functional areas in terms of the labor, the equipment, the fleet maintenance, and then the indirect costs that get allocated to those services as well. And the cost of service analysis does go through and provide what the allocation method was for those indirect costs, because it varies depending on what type of indirect cost it is. Sometimes it's based on the amount of staff that are in that particular function. Sometimes it's based on the tonnage that's managed in that function. And it's a standard accounting practice to go through and do all of that. And then we have those financial adjustments that we were talking about that occur annually, that come in as a hit to the fund at the end of all the other pieces. And while they were very sizable in the last few years for OPEB and for GASB, my understanding is that was an initial funding of those requirements, and that going forward there will be adjustments from year to year, but those adjustments should be more modest relative to the initial funding burden that had to be met. That initial funding is exactly why you want to make sure you maintain a good, healthy fund balance, because those accounting changes do happen, they hit you, and you have to comply, so you want to make sure that you've got funds there for that. So then we develop unit costs for each of these functional areas, dollars per household per month for residential services, and then dollars per lift for commercial services. And the reason it's different for commercial is that commercial service is much more variable. Businesses have a range of different days of collection or number of days that they're collected during the week, and they have different container sizes. So in order to standardize that, how much does it cost each time that that container gets lifted? And then we can apply a factor to look at the differences in the size of the container as well, and be able to make comparisons of costs that way. So on a high level, this pie chart shows how costs break out by direct expenses, indirect expenses, and then those financial adjustments. So about 75% of current costs are in direct costs, and it was about $13.7 million in fiscal 18. And then indirect expenses and financial adjustments make up the other 25% or so, and they were about equally split between the two of them, around $2.5 million apiece. So if we zero in just on the residential pieces here, so the first 1, 2, 3 pies that are orange up there on the chart, if we're going from 12 o'clock down to about 3 o'clock, residential services work out to be about $29 per household per month. So if you break that up and you look at the different components of the residential collection separately, you see that there's a big difference between each of those different collection areas in terms of what it costs to pick it up from each household. And when you look at the bar chart, it shows you what goes into those costs. So where are those differences? Labor is one area where there's a difference. Between waste and compost, that is city staff that's collecting both of those waste streams. Those are city employees. But compost collection is a lower cost per household per month because of the use of temporary labor for a lot of that service during fiscal 18. So they're paid at a lower wage. They have a lower fringe rate. In addition to the fact that compost collection is only done over a 9-month period, and we have 12 months in a year.
So could you go back, I'm sorry, could you go back one slide? Why the big disparity between collection expenses between recycling and residential waste?
So that's going to be, we'll explain that through looking at the graph here.
Okay.
So that disparity comes on the labor. So as I was saying, with the waste and compost, there's a difference, and those are city staff. On the recycling collection, that labor cost is actually the recycling and Arbor contract cost, which predominantly is for labor. It does include a small amount of additional maintenance costs that they chip in, but it predominantly is reflective of labor cost for that recycling collection. That is a contracted cost. That is also a contract that is old and has an escalation factor that was built into it, so it may, just through escalation, may have kind of priced itself out of the norms of what labor costs are, but that's a standard element of long-term contracts that we have that risk.
But that's also presumably including the labor costs of shipping all the recycling to Cincinnati?
No.
That are,
No, those labor costs are purely for the collection element of the recycling collection. The processing cost, which is the red bar, which is the it's the tallest bar on that graph, that is inclusive of your transportation to Cincinnati. And so you see there is a much higher cost to process every ton that you collect for recycling compared to waste and composting. That cost, so there is an element of that is the transportation. A lot of that is actual processing cost. So we can get you the numbers because they were not, I don't believe they were in the cost of service, but I've worked them up. I just haven't documented them for everybody yet, of what the transportation element of that works out to be and back calculates to be. It's a smaller fraction than you would think in reality. And it's going to a large regional MRF that has efficiencies through the fact that they draw from a very large regional area. So their actual on-site processing cost is probably lower than what you would have for a MRF in this market. Just as just based on what we see for different sizes of MRFs that are out there in the tonnage that you would have supporting a MRF here versus going to a larger MRF that has a very large tonnage pool that it draws from. So I know everybody is really interested in trying to save those costs that you're spending on recycling processing and trying to bring it back here. You would certainly get a lot of greenhouse gas reductions as a part of that, which would be very important. But at this point, the markets are so volatile that to be able to say how much you would save on the recycling processing by doing it locally versus contracting it to a more distant facility, you may not get as much savings as you think you would.
I have a question about that, but are you including the income that you would get from recycling other cities' materials if we were operating a MRF?
If we were operating a MRF here, we haven't done that analysis yet, so we don't know.
But there would be.
There is revenue that comes from the materials, for sure. But the cost to process the material now, even just to get it clean enough that you can even sell it to a market, is growing because you have to slow the processing system down. So you're incurring more labor costs. It takes more time to sort the same ton of trash than it used to because there is a cleanliness standard. And then the markets themselves are so depressed that the cost per ton that's being paid when it does get sold to market, if you can sell it to market, because we are hearing facilities are having a hard time selling certain streams, is much, much lower. And there's a revenue share usually that goes along with that. So you do get a revenue share in your current contract. And in fact, this shows us what it was in fiscal 18 relative to other years. That revenue share, if we were to look at it today, is going to be even smaller because the basket of commodities is less valuable than it was on average over fiscal year 18. So yes, there's a lot of pieces that go into that and a lot of balancing in those numbers. But recycling just frankly is bleak right now. It's a costly activity. I don't think that anybody right now is recycling because of the value in an economic sense.
Yep.
but we all think that this is, or we all hear from different sources that this is a temporary situation, and we're perhaps midway through it. And in fact, like Pratt Industries and other companies are building new recycling processing capacity in the Midwest.
And I think that there's a lot of optimism around that. The reality is yet to be seen because we haven't seen any numbers come in where anyone's committing through a contractual number that they will in fact pay a better price or will have a lower processing cost. So I think there is hope around that the processing options are going to be stronger. But right now, even the demand for the recovered material is low. So the ability to get a higher price for the commodities is based on that demand from the outside markets, which we may or may not see recovery in. This isn't the first time that we've had down commodity markets either. So one of the follow-up items that we're going to be sending to the advisory committee, and we can make sure that you all get as well, is what those national, the commodity pricing trends have been, both from index factors, which is what a lot of the pricing is based off of when you get your revenue share, as well as what you've seen in your own contract, to see, this isn't the first time that they've been low. They do recover. They did recover before. We're hopeful they'll recover this time. But from a planning standpoint and a funding standpoint, much better to be surprised and have extra money sitting there because markets recovered than to not have any ability to pay for the program in the first place. Because we don't want to cut that program off. Nobody wants to do that. So in recycling processing, over the last 3 years, you've had 3 different contracts. So a lot of different price points out there. Kind of the common denominator to all of this is that the net cost of recycling has continued to go up on a per ton basis, and in fact has gone up by double. So in 16, you were at about $45 per ton, and in 18, it was over 90. That's likely even higher now, again, because of those depressed commodity prices. And what isn't shown on here is the impact of the sunk costs in the city's MRF, those depreciation costs, and the maintenance that goes along with keeping that facility up, which adds about another $100. So it would push costs up to $190 per ton net on the recycling. So those costs are going to continue to be borne until either that depreciation is completed or if there's a one-time write-off of that, which would be a big hit to the fund.
If I remember correctly, and maybe I am completely wrong on this, but was Waste Management recycling all of our residential materials? Because for some reason, I thought that I remembered that it was just cardboard and paper or something.
Just real quick. Yes, for that graph, if I go the right way, yes. For the first, I believe it was year in the end, when we stopped with RS and stopped the contract, Waste Management ended up doing it for just short of a calendar year, and it was all of the community recycling. So they did take cardboard to I think it was Saginaw was their facility, similar to what RAA does with the merchant or the commercial cardboard, or OCC it's called. They take to a local MRF as well, so same approach.
Okay.
So, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Before we get too far away from it, I had a question on slide 21 about street side cans.
Okay, so yes, and I kind of skipped right over that. So street side cans, those are gonna be your litter cans that are downtown for pedestrian cans, and then city special events. We built that into the residential cost per household because typically in a community where those services are contracted out to a private company for collection, that private contractor also provides collection of those street side containers. They'll provide collection at municipal buildings. So in order to be able to compare the city's costs against other cities' costs, we went ahead and added it in. So it's about another $1 per household per month. And that would typically, if you were on a user fee system, that would be where you would end up getting a payment for those services rather than the city paying itself for those services.
And so then like going back into the warm months, we've had last year trouble with overflowing trash cans down at the parks by the canoe liveries and such. And is that gonna be under commercial? Or would these street side cans be also the park cans?
I'd have to go back and confirm where those costs are recognized in the city's services budget and answer that question because I'm not exactly sure. There's a portion of the parks that are served by city crews. There's a portion that gets assigned to parks, which was rolled into the city events and street side cans. So in one way or another, in the really big piece of pies, it's all in there. But exactly where those particularly would fit, I can't answer right now.
Yes, well, and then just the takeaway that, like the alleys, those park cans are overflowing a lot in the summer months and blowing around and heaped up around the can.
Okay, that's good to know. Yes, again, speaks to a higher level of service that maybe is needed or change in those containers, so.
Thanks.
All right, so the last thing, revenues and expenses, how did they compare? Just kind of closing the loop on everything. On the left, we have our revenues. So this is what comes in through the residential and commercial properties contributing to the millage. Those are the levy portions of that bar. The fees for services are primarily the fees that are paid by commercial properties for their collection. And then you've got royalties, revenue shares, and other miscellaneous revenue that comes in through interest, and then off of the third-party material that's handled at the compost facility and the sale of compost off of that facility. And that compares against the expenses, and you can see that residential services expenses are higher than what the residential levy brings in. So somehow those costs are being subsidized, and it looks as though commercial services may have a small subsidy that's going towards the residential portion of the service. So those commercial service costs are slightly less than what's generated between the commercial levy and the fees for service. So there's a small imbalance, not nearly as large as I would have expected to see, just as at a gut level before really digging into the numbers, because of that millage-based funding for the programs. But this shows you that when you add those financial adjustments on top, that we did in fact have a higher expense than revenue for fiscal 18. So this just goes through that same kind of summary, and that we had that punchline of the fund balance declined last year. So last piece here I want to go through quickly is the resident survey. We did conduct our resident survey the last week of March. It was a phone-based survey of 400 members of the community, randomly selected, and it was a 15-minute questionnaire that they went through. We asked them about 30 content questions, and then there were a handful of other questions on top of that that were screening questions up front to make sure they were a resident of the city, and demographic questions on the back end to make sure that they were demographically representative sample-wide of the city. We have a margin of error of plus or minus 4.9% at the 95% confidence level, so that means that if, based on an answer that says that 50% of the population feels this way, we can be 95% sure that it's going to be between 45 and 55% of the population that is in agreement on that. So it's a high level of confidence with a reasonably good margin of error. When you look at the results there, we provided what we call the top line results, which is just all the numerical responses for that survey, in addition to the draft report from our survey firm within your packet. When you look at the top line results, you'll see questions that have a labeling of SSA or SSB sometimes. Those are split sampled questions. So half of the respondents were asked A questions, half of them were asked B questions, and that enabled us to ask more questions and get feedback from people on a bigger spread of questions, and also to vary those questions slightly without having the risk of survey fatigue or confusion by the survey respondent, because there's enough similarity in two questions that they go with their last answer because it sounds like the same question again. So what we learned from the survey, the general satisfaction with city services is high. Garbage collection satisfaction, about 96% of people are either very satisfied or somewhat satisfied, and it's pretty similar on the recycling collection. We do see a lower level of satisfaction with compost collection, with 66% saying that they're either very or somewhat satisfied. But here we also have 23% who said they don't know. And that's likely because we have rental tenants who have no yard that they maintain. They don't have any use of the compost collection system in that case, or a homeowner that has a landscaper that takes care of all of their materials and they don't interact with it that way. But we do see that there is a somewhat higher level of dissatisfaction that was reported for compost collection as well, at 11%. We wanted to find out if people feel that they have enough information or whether they need more information from the city. This kind of speaks to that education and outreach need that we'll be looking at. And what we found is that people are most strongly interested in education or information about how to handle less frequent materials that the city doesn't collect every week curbside. That's your e-waste, your HHW, bulky items. But there's still a reasonable interest and need for information on all city services in general, and on recycling and compost services. And a lesser feel a need for garbage service information. That's something that they feel they have a pretty good handle on. And then we were asking indirectly through awareness type questions or through usage type questions about specific programs. We asked if people were aware that they could place food scraps in their compost cart. And this was asked of everyone, regardless of whether they have a cart or not. And 43% of people said, no, I didn't know that. So almost half the population doesn't know that that's an option that's available. When we asked people who do have a cart, and, why they don't put more food waste in their cart. They said that they didn't put very much food waste in their cart or didn't put any. 25% of those people said that they didn't know that it could go in the cart. So even when they have a cart, people don't know that it's available. And that's the same finding that we had when we did this survey 2 or 3 years ago for the organics plan. So again, still an opportunity to do that awareness and outreach. And then we asked people, what's the biggest factor that limits how much you recycle? And some people said, I recycle everything I can. So when people said, well, I do have this limiter, 33% of them said, I don't know what's recyclable. So again, there's an opportunity there to provide information. We asked residents about what additional services they might want. And if it came with a cost increase, how willing they would be to pay for that. And 27% said they want bulky waste collection. Another 27% said that they want year-round compost collection. And then 13% each said expanded HHW options and e-waste options. 7% of people said, don't do anything, I don't want any increase in my cost. And on that willingness to pay, not surprisingly, people were far more willing to pay if it was a modest cost increase of $1 to $3 per month, and that willingness to pay went down as you went up in those costs, but half of people still were somewhat willing to pay $8 to $10 per month just for one additional service within the community. We also wanted to know how people feel about how they actually pay for services. We asked them, based on how you pay for service now, which is a fee that's based on the value of your home, do you support that or do you oppose that? And there was strong support for that. 68% of people said, I'm good with that. 27% of people said they opposed it. By comparison, we asked them, well, if we instead took it off of your property taxes, gave you a monthly bill, and we charged everybody the same. We charged everybody the $29 a month that the cost of service says. Now we see a reversal in that, and we've got 55% of people that oppose that approach and only 36% that support it. And then we asked them about whether they would support a structure where they pay for their service based on a different size of their garbage can. So this was a split sampled question, so half the people were asked if it was $27 for a 32-gallon cart, $29 for a 64-gallon cart, and $31 for a 96-gallon cart. Do you support or oppose that? 65% supported it. We asked the other half if it was $27, $54, or $81, which is obviously a much bigger price swing between those different can sizes, but consistent with the pricing that we see in a lot of West Coast communities and other communities that have those graduated can prices. We still see about the same level of support with 64%. The level of opposition did go up in that to about 31%.
Why would you ask for a $2 difference?
So the $2 difference is based on the actual difference in cost of service for those. So there's two different ways you can look at funding your system. You can look at passing the actual costs along, or you can artificially price things based on the desire to create an economic incentive to change a behavior. So we wanted to test both of those and see whether there was a difference, first of all, whether there's enough incentive in the 27, 54, 81 that they're still willing to consider it. There would definitely be further thought that needs to go into how those prices would actually be set. What we wanted to make sure was that we did not set the lowest tier price at a point that wouldn't recover the city's costs. So the city's actual cost, if you were collecting a 32-gallon cart from a home, is going to be $27 per household. And if everybody decided to select that level of service, you have to make sure you're covering your base level of cost. So that's why we went with, here's our actual, here's something that's artificially inflated in order to intend to drive a behavior.
Can you explain, where are these numbers in the bar graph, the 68 and the 49, or the 27 and the 18, what are those?
So the dark bar at the bottom is the portion that strongly support or that are very willing on some of these others where the different ratings were used. And then the lighter portion is the somewhat support or somewhat willing.
Did you consider anything with like people who didn't put it out every week?
So more of a pay-per-use type of
Yeah, frequency
an
of
option.
pickup or
It's,
something.
we talked about whether we could ask that question. We had a constraint on the amount of time, people are only willing to stay on the phone for so long. We had a lot of topics we wanted to cover. There's a lot of explanation that needs to go into getting a response on that type of a question. And so it was decided that at this stage, that was not something we were going to test through the survey, of to whether they would, set out on a less frequent basis. So the last thing, we added a question to the survey based on some input that the city's been working with one of the community resource groups at Community High on a solid waste education and outreach project. And they came up with an idea that aligns with the city's kind of sustainable business challenge of if we could recognize businesses with a badge or a sticker that says we're a sustainable business, would people be more likely to shop or eat at those locations? And people, in fact, said, yeah, we would, to the tune of 70% of people saying that's important to me and I would favor those businesses. So I'm going to let Crescent come up, say a couple of words in closing about where we're headed. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you, Christina. And yeah, just to wrap up and preview for our next steps and where we're headed, is completing the financial model and the fund balance projections as we talked about, and developing the draft recommendations, taking the options that Christina touched on. Hopefully have some time here to get some reaction from you folks, or at least try to answer some questions so we can get some follow-up written comments. But taking that and the input from the advisory committee and further staff and consultant team evaluation, develop those into draft recommendations and putting together the final report, and then coming back to the advisory committee as well as the commission, and really take those initial recommendations and work them towards a final set of final recommendations and plan, and then coming back to you folks to wrap things up before we finish. And so with that was our last slide. And I think we'll turn it over. I'm not sure, I guess I'll turn it over to Vice, didn't even catch this, Vice Chair Skinner, but.
Vice Chair, yes.
Commissioner Skinner, Vice Chair Skinner. If we want to either generally or to the, back to the options, but we'll leave that at the leisure of the commission. And then whoever's most appropriate will come up to answer whatever questions we have.
Okay, thank you. Does anyone have any questions?
Councilman Bannister.
I did
Oh, sorry, I
have,
didn't see
well,
your
I
hand.
was just remembering our presentation on storm drains from Jennifer Lawson back in March. And she talked about how leaf pickup done right, not when it's left laying in the street for many weeks and freezing and slippery for bicyclists and whatnot, not like that, but when it's picked up on a timely basis, that helps reduce greenhouse gas emissions from a composting leaf. And so I've been talking with residents about this. Different residents say, no, you should grind them up and put them in your flower bed. And others say, we should carry them away. And so I was wondering, leaf pickup. How come that didn't rate in this study, or why it was probably eliminated early on, maybe?
I can go back to when we worked on the organics plan. It was something that we talked about, and there was a decision made by the city to require containerization of leaves for pickup. That containerization increases the safety aspects. It makes sure that it's not just sitting out in the public way. It's not in the way for bicyclists. It's not being started on fire with a tailpipe that is making contact with it while the car is warming up. And requiring it to be bagged. So having it bagged and taken to the compost facility that gets put into the compost pile right away, it does shorten that amount of time that those leaves are held. This goes back to some of the outreach components of encouraging people to manage material in a different way other than entering the solid waste system. So don't create it in the first place, or compost it at home, mulch it on your lawn. You have a lot of properties here that have a lot of tree cover, so that's not going to be an option for everybody. But that is another element of that education that you can provide. We haven't looked at adding or changing that leaf collection process. It would probably be a cost savings for the city to go back to doing more of like a vacuum pickup or a loose leaf pickup, only from the sense that there's a whole additional crews and trucks that have to be rented to support leaf collection season because it's all bagged, and a lot of manual handling of that material. But you have to weigh that against those public safety, aesthetic, community needs too.
I would just add that I think you make it sound like everybody collects them and put them in bags and that they all go away. It's just not the case. And so what happens is a portion of people do that, but I would say the majority of it sits in the street from the city trees, and the impact is on our waterways for water quality as well as greenhouse gas emissions. So I think in terms of the calculus of how you kind of think about that question, I think that it isn't just everybody bags up their stuff and puts it in a nice little neat thing and it heads off to the composting facility. I think the reality is that some people who really care about getting every leaf off do that, and I just mulch mine in, but I don't take care of the stuff in the street.
So
You know, so in other
meaning
words.
it lands in the street because it fell off the tree and it's in
Yeah,
the street
because
now.
it's the
Okay.
street tree, and I mow all of my, I mulch all of my stuff into my lawn, but I don't go into the street, gather it all up, put it on my lawn, and then mulch it in.
It's something that we could talk about to understand the operational aspects and, you know, whose responsibility does that fall on? Is that a street maintenance issue with street sweeping, or is there some of the collection aspect to it, and does it fit into this process?
Yeah, so I think that I would be interested in having that be part of, like a bigger part of the discussion in terms of how these things get figured out, because I think it's just, I don't think it's happening in the way that you're discussing. I think it's, the actual pattern is different than that. And that, as a water quality person, it does matter a lot, actually, in terms of water quality and greenhouse gas emissions and things like that. So just some feedback on that piece. Yeah, and that, but they used to have it come and they'd forklift it up and put it into the trucks and take it away, and that's just a totally different scene now than the street sweeping in terms of the amount that really gets dealt with, I would say.
I feel though that the issue you're talking about is because they fall and they land in the street, which through
Right.
that leaf collection process where they would come and pick them up, probably wasn't getting picked up then either, other
No,
than if it
it
happened to land on the
totally was.
pile.
It was getting, people would rake it into the street.
But that's,
Or-
I think that's different
Right.
than leaves that find their way into the street.
Yeah, that's right, but there's still a lot, right, but there's still a lot of leaves in the street, no matter how you slice it,
I
you
think
know.
Jen's point in March was that, you know, having a better strategy for dealing with sweeping the streets for leaves specifically in the fall will improve water quality. I think that was the point she was making.
Right.
Absolutely, yeah, and so we've committed to do at least 2 fall sweepings now, and the problem is that the leaves are falling later. We're
Right.
scrambling to get out and complete those 2 cycles before winter comes, and then
Right.
we have to stop or be interrupted.
Right.
And then they just sit there. So looking at what we can do, last year we rented 4 extra sweepers, and I think that helps some, but it's still, the problem persists.
Yeah.
And so we continue to look at it.
Yeah.
So I have one final question, and I know you talked about outreach and engagement not being part of this discussion, but one of the things I would be interested in seeing in this final report is, you know, how do peer cities that are high-performing do these services? Are they in-house? Do they contract? Do they have a community partner? I think we need a lot of help on how to do that effectively.
Absolutely, and that's part of the reason we don't have it yet, is we're making that outreach to those communities. I'm working with a contact at Recology, who is the provider for services both in San Francisco and in Seattle, and they do a lot of that outreach. So we're working back and forth to get that type of information pulled together to understand what the contracted side of that service is and partnership side of that service is, as well as getting into contact with the people within the communities that have the, you know, at the municipal staff level that are involved in that to figure out what that level of effort is. Now, those are much larger cities than Ann Arbor, so you know, the effort may not be proportional directly. We want to make sure we understand it well enough to understand how it would scale to this size of community.
Any other questions?
Mike?
He rescinded his question. All right. Thank
Thank
you
you.
so much.
Thank you. I look forward to being with you guys another couple months here.
All right, so next on the agenda, we have a resolution to approve Ann Arbor's membership in the Washtenaw Regional, what does this acronym stand for? The Regional Waste Management Authority?
Regional Resource Management Authority.
Resource Management Authority. Susan, would you like to introduce?
Yeah, since you're the chair of our
Okay.
committee, why don't you?
Yeah, I'll do that. I'll just read it directly off the Legistar page.
Thank you.
So the title is the Environmental Commission Resolution to Recommend City Council approve the city's constituent membership in the Washtenaw Regional Resource Management Authority. We call it WRMA for short, before June 1st, 2019. So the body of the text is, whereas regional recycling authorities permit members to manage multiple materials in order to increase community diversion rates and decrease landfill amounts, to save costs through economics and efficiencies of scale that cities and counties cannot attain on their own, to share risk and investment among community partners, and to consolidate educational efforts and provide consistent messages to all residents within the authority. And whereas there are more than a dozen authorities in Michigan, such as MMWA, the Mid-Michigan Waste Authority, and within Southeast Michigan, such as WWRA, the Western Washtenaw Recycling Authority, and SACRA, the South Oakland County Resource Recovery Authority, and RRRA SOC, Resource Recovery and Recycling Authority of Southwest Oakland County. These have all successfully reduced costs, increased diversion rates, and improved levels of services. Whereas the benefits that would accrue to Ann Arbor and its community partners by achieving an economy of scale through a regional authority would benefit Ann Arbor and its community partners rather than private or contract haulers. And whereas in 2017, Washtenaw County amended its solid waste plan to operate collaboratively within the county and regionally outside of the county for a comprehensive sustainable materials management strategy. And whereas representatives from Ann Arbor Township, the City of Ann Arbor, the City of Dexter, Pittsfield Township, Pittsfield Charter Township, the City of Saline, the Township of Scioto, the City of Ypsilanti, and the Charter Township of Ypsilanti met monthly over a 12-month period to draft articles of incorporation. And whereas institutions such as University of Michigan and Eastern Michigan University were also part of this process. And whereas the City of Ann Arbor participated in the Authority Formation Committee that developed articles of incorporation of the Washtenaw Regional Resource Management Authority. And whereas Ann Arbor is the only municipality that participated in drafting WRMA's articles of incorporation that has not joined the authority as yet. And whereas the first-year dues for joining the authority is a relatively modest $5,000 and defines a period in which the authority would coordinate communications, improve outreach to increase the quality and quantity of the recycling streams, gather and analyze members' communities' concerns, define priorities, elect officers, and develop relevant metrics. And whereas prospective authority representatives have expressed a strong desire to increase the quantity and quality of the recycling stream first, with a desire to move closer to zero waste over the long term. And whereas the Environmental Commission adopted a zero waste goal in 2007. And whereas the City of Ann Arbor did not make any progress on its diversion rate, zero waste, or commercial recycling goals as specified in its 2013 to 2017 Solid Waste Resource Update Plan. Whereas if Ann Arbor does not join WRMA by June 1st, 2019, the city must either submit a petition to each member to be added to the authority or join as a non-voting member, a status that will eventually be offered to area institutions such as the University of Michigan. And whereas on January 24th, 2019, Washtenaw County Public Works presented the Environmental Commission with background and information on WRMMA. And whereas on January 24th, also the Environmental Commission unanimously approved a resolution to recommend that City Council approve the city become a constituent member of the Washtenaw Regional Resource Management Authority. And whereas each member of the authority initially receives one vote as the authority evolves and makes multi-year commitments, capital financing, or long-term risk programming can be governed by weighted votes that protect the city's interests and offer the city commensurately greater influences. And whereas the authority is not empowered to impose unilateral directions or change contracts that affect members without gaining approval, and whereas WRRMA intends to integrate each charter community's current and future solid waste plans and assessments into WRRMA discussions on an ongoing basis, which means there is no benefit to waiting until the city's solid waste resource management plan update is completed in July 2019. And whereas the city's ability to determine specific contracts that meet Ann Arbor's living wage ordinance require unionized employees, and other existing requirements would remain within the city's purview and would not be decisions over which the authority would have any governing power. Therefore, be it resolved that the Environmental Commission recommends the city join Washtenaw Regional Resource Management Authority to develop a regional approach to materials management strategies and becomes a constituent member of WRRMA.
Thank
That's
you.
it.
Do we have a second?
Can we,
Commissioner
is there
Harden?
discussion?
After the second.
Okay, after the second.
Is there any discussion?
I'm just curious how what you presented dovetails with what was just presented in terms of, like, was this all in the context of the city have its own gig, or is this in the context of a regional facility? Kind of a big
No,
picture
no, this is,
question.
well, okay, yeah. Who's first?
Yeah, actually, the scope for the RFP to solicit work, we already knew the county plan was coming about, and things were starting in terms of talking about regionalization. So that was already built in. When we went out even to search for
Okay.
the work, it's got to be factored in. So part of the, actually, the early advisory committees. That's what I get.
Start over.
Molly told me to turn it on. I'll throw Molly under the
Start
bus.
over.
Under the trash truck. But, so to quickly recap, it was included in the scope of work when we went out for the RFP, because we knew it was coming. We were involved initially and anticipated it. So it's built into the awareness. And what I was just going to mention that with our first two advisory committee meetings, there was an actual sections in the presentation and discussion that I gave updates on where we were at with that, so that everyone stayed involved and the awareness was there. Knowing that things like, consistent approach within the region, broader education and outreach and working jointly. And back to that common thing, the MRF, and quite frankly, to think back, and as Howard mentioned when he started, that was, quite frankly, one of the things that kicked off from us to try to nudge the county to look at this, because we felt, as staff at the time, it needs that regional, it's got the capacity for that, and that's gonna help get it restarted, so.
Okay, so
Yeah.
what you presented today is really within the context of a county-wide regional system, not as a,
So that comes back to some of the service delivery side of the equation. With the options that we've priced at this point, we've looked at everything as if it's a city-only service, because there has been no commitment yet to a regionalization. And when we draft the plan, we'll be identifying the areas where a regional approach would make a more effective or efficient implementation for those types of options. So on those, smaller waste streams, the e-waste and HHW, those kind of historically have been handled partially as a county collaboration, or even entirely as county service with the toxics collection at their facility. The drop-off station formerly was jointly funded through a regional fund. So we can certainly identify where it makes sense for those things to be done regionally. And, without having the decision made, it makes things in the plan a little less clear, because a decision hasn't been made on whether to be in or out of that authority. But I don't think it doesn't hinder the plan directly.
okay.
So,
I would simply add is that when this was before council to consider, there were a couple of primary considerations that council was concerned about. Which is, number one, it's only one vote on this board. And we are far and away the largest community, the biggest funder. And, we would want to be a little bit assured of the fact that we would be the 800-pound gorilla in this equation. And, I think that's a legitimate thing. As the solid waste subcommittee worked, it was very, when we reached out to a couple different folks that had experience working with regional authorities, it's very common for the weighted voting to be used in these. And I think joining now gives us the ability to influence that and to make a big deal. The other major concern that was brought up at council is, what does this do to our solid waste labor contract? The council has passed a resolution saying we commit to using our AFSCME labor to collect trash in the city. This is not, the purpose of this really is not to regionalize trash collection. That will remain a city service done by city staff per council direction. This is really about recycling. And I think as we were able to suss out some of those details that were covered in this resolution, I believe that addresses the primary concerns that council has. I worry about missing the deadline to get in there, and if we're not a part of it, then it really isn't much. But I think it's very important for us to join and say, we're going to drive this bus, and we're going to, we're taking the lion's share of the risk, so we're going to exert our influence appropriately. And I think to be able to get in there and to say, this is what we would like to do, and if our contribution is X, we need these things. And I think that that's clear expectation of what this resolution tries to get at.
Yep. Yeah, that's why it was drafted. It was to address principally concerns expressed by council during a meeting back in March when this first came up. And it's certainly there's little risk that we cannot capture economies of scale and that our labor contracts are not at risk. And there is experience locally and nationally that this kind of operation can work very well as it's currently structured. So.
Any other discussion?
Well, I'm just pleasantly surprised that all of the concerns have been resolved, in the whereas clauses and at this discussion. So, that's great.
I think some of it is we're not, as council, always particularly clear about the key things, and, this bubbled up to us without, these things being addressed in a way that the body was comfortable with. And I think, I'd like to reintroduce this and have this explanation, to say that we believe that this does address the concerns expressed by council. Let's move on with it.
Yeah, and those of us who've looked into the issue are happy to talk to any council member about any questions they might have about it, since there is this
Perhaps,
June
during the
1st
meeting,
deadline.
During the council meeting, we might need some of that reassurance.
Okay.
Any other discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? All right, the resolution passes. Moving on, do we have reports from committees, other commissions, council, and chair? Anyone want to go first?
Well, John Mercy's not here,
Yeah.
but he provided a summary of the Energy Commission that I can read if people are interested.
I read his email, but
Yeah, I
go
read
ahead
it
and
too.
read it if you'd like.
He also,
Yeah.
it gave his support for the resolution that we just passed,
Yeah.
in email to all of us.
So we could just put it in the minutes, or we could,
Yeah?
okay.
That sounds good. Anything from planning commission?
I would just say that to the committee that's working on natural features, that I would like to up the ante a little bit on a heritage tree kind of designation, because there's been some things that have come through where it really would have been nice to lean on that, and we don't currently have anything for the trees that were here long before any white settlers got here that are kind of iconic and part of our town. So I would just say that a little bit of pressure in that direction would be really helpful, because there's no code that we can lean on for that. And then the other thing is that the DTE site on Broadway went through another step in the process in terms of getting their area plan approved, and that, you know, with that comes a lot of brownfield redevelopment and cleanup that comes with it, as well as a good chunk of city park that gets added, and those both, you know, have access to the river, things like that, have impact on the kinds of things we discuss here. So those two items, I would say.
Thank you. Is there an update from council?
And I had a follow-up question on that. So on that last one where you're saying the brownfield, was there an action step in there?
No, I mean, it's contingent upon, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Like, that's part of the process, but I'm just saying
An
that,
update.
like, right now, you know, it is what it is, and there's contamination there. And some of it's been dealt with and some of it hasn't been, but as part of this development, that would be taken to the next level of improvement.
I don't think this has not come to brownfields yet, so.
No, yeah, it's still early in the process, it's only an area plan, so, yeah.
Okay, well, thank you. My briefly updates, we, down at the Center City last weekend, we had celebrated 2 Earth Days on both Sunday and Monday. And we read the mayoral proclamation on both days, and that was well received. And I want to thank Commissioner Brown for staffing the Sierra Club booth at the Earth Day. Thank you very much. And our friends from the KI Potassium Fermi 2 Emergency Nuclear Preparedness Group also had an exhibit table at Earth Day. So we were, Paul Gunther's brother, Keith Gunther, is also involved. And so they were happy to be there. And they're moving to use Ann Arbor, our resolution, to have KI potassium pills to Detroit City Council. So they're going to reference us as a positive influence on that. And then just briefly, Councilmember Smith and I are getting any budget amendments together. So that was very timely that Commissioner Gabrando would mention heritage trees. The Natural Features Group is meeting on Friday at noon. And I remember, Commissioner Hutton, you had said about a you pick it possibly. And so at this point, Commissioner Smith and I would recommend, or I'm speaking for him, however, but if you all have any 1 or 2 sentence wish list for budget amendments along the lines of heritage tree protections, or chimney swifts, or leaf pickup, or you pick it, or recycling guides linking properly to all of our recycling guides. Or I went to a food gatherers meeting this week, and they had suggested that they might have a need for a stepped up pickup of their waste, extra waste. They give away most all of the vegetables that they can and the food that they can, but there's a certain amount of extra that is not handled in the most optimum way. Maybe even some is going just plain in the trash. So these were some of the ideas, and so if that sparks any idea that you wanted, please email them over. Councilmember Smith and I will need to submit any amendments no later than May 15th. So if you had something on your wish list, please let us know. Thank you.
Councilmember Smith, do you have an update?
Just very briefly reminding everybody to come out to Leslie Science Center this weekend for Earth Day celebration on Sunday. It's quite an experience up there. Regrettably, I'll be watching third grade soccer in Kalamazoo. So this will be the first one I've missed since I've lived here, and we've been doing it. But it's, anybody watching on TV, this is a really fantastic family opportunity to get out and to learn more about the environment and things that you can do, particularly regarding environmental protection and climate change mitigation.
Any other commissions or committees I've missed have updates?
The water working group met. We are still working on our goals and measurements, but we are talking about doing a green infrastructure vision plan, and we need to do some more work with staff to figure out the best way to do that, to figure out what kind of data that we have, and it feels like that might be a preliminary step to revising the green streets policy.
Yeah, and the only update for the solid waste working group, other than this resolution, would be we've contacted city staff to talk to them about discussing metrics for solid waste, diversion numbers, and relevant numbers to track, and basically meaningful, hard metrics that will be useful for a number of years, and that will also be and we'll also specify data collection methods going forward.
Thank you. Do we, oh,
I just thought of one more. I was just wondering if Josh wanted to update us on that exciting news that we've got a data download from DTE on, yeah.
Yeah, do we want to go ahead? We can just go to the report from staff if you
Yep.
want to do that? Okay, I'll try to keep this kind of quick. So, a couple of things going on. Fire station number 6. We actually have volunteers to come up and put solar on fire station number 6. Anyone in the community, in the audience, if you guys are interested in volunteering, you can get in touch with me directly, jmacdonald@a2gov.org. We also have a patronicity site up to be able to raise some money for those solar panels. So a lot of exciting things going on. The time frame right now is looking about middle to late part of May. So it's all coming up really quickly. There's also a solar power hour. So we're doing these kind of community solar power hours, information for the community on both renewables as well as energy efficiency that can be done in people's homes. We have the last of a series of 3 coming up April 29th at Cobblestone Farm at 6 p.m. So again, anyone listening from home, anyone in the audience who'd like to learn more about things that they could do in their home as far as renewables, energy efficiency, please come. Should be a good time. You already kind of covered the Earth Day celebrations. You beat me to it.
Sorry to steal your thunder.
Yeah, you know. But yeah, everyone should definitely come out. It's a wonderful time. There's a lot of activities for kids, live music. So that's a great time. And then finally, the kind of greenhouse gas inventory update, which we're currently working on internally. We do have the data from DTE. It took a little while, but we're currently crunching those numbers. Some of those numbers are actually waste related. So we do transportation, waste, we do residential, commercial, industrial sectors as far as natural gas and electricity. So pretty much we try to cover as much of the gamut as we can for community emissions. And so we're thinking we'll probably have it done in the next couple of weeks here, be presenting to the Energy Commission and then coming in and presenting as well to the Environmental Commission. So stay tuned for that. And that is all I have.
all right. Any items for our next agenda? Our next scheduled meeting is Thursday, May 23rd at 7 p.m. right here. Is there anyone here for public comment? Last chance. Step up. And if you'll just state your name.
Yes, I'm Amy Ciccarelli. Okay, I guess the first thing I would like to address is the solar power and the the roads being fixed. There is self-healing concrete that has a bacteria in it that helps the concrete fix itself. And so I'd like to mention that. And then drainage systems. I heard, he's not here anymore, Mr. Lazarus, talking about drainage in a dam. I'm interested in that because the hydro dams, the water systems, I heard last, at the city council meeting, they were talking about 7 miles of piping systems being put in. Is that correct? 7 miles.
I know the berm was.
They were saying 7 miles of new drainage systems being put in. That could be utilized. That was one of the things that the DDA.
We might have a webpage on the dam.
Right, there's 7 miles of drainage systems being put in when they're fixing the roads, and that could be utilized for water power. And then when they do the $22 million parking structure that's proposed, wind and water and solar can all be utilized, because the parking structure, if it's slanted, as parking structures are, water will run down it, and they can capture the water and then use that as a part of renewable energy as well. And then as far as the waste systems and recycling, I don't know if you've seen these recycling, one of the things they have in Europe is where you take and you go on the bus and you go to like a convenience machine and you put a can in and you get a pop out. Okay, that's one thing they have. And then they have where you go along the highway and you go to like a station where you go through the toll booth and you put in an aluminum can and it goes through a thing where it goes to right where it makes it forms into a mold where they're doing construction on the highway. You know what I'm saying? It goes right to where the construction workers, it like actually molds into the shape that they're using on the highway. So rather than having all this fuss and muss and putting stuff off to Saginaw and everything else, we could be utilizing aluminum cans by taking them right onto our toll booth, you know, and also there are big machines that we could put right here in Ann Arbor and have a recycling station of our own, which would reduce cost, rather than shipping it out to Ohio like you were saying. Those are just some ideas that I had. So, wind, solar, water, and then hydro electric dams. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, if there's nothing else. Oh, yep, please.
Thanks, Ken Garber. And thanks for everyone for all the great work you're doing on behalf of the city on these incredibly important issues. I was listening to the survey results, and some things really caught my attention. Almost half of city residents don't know that you can put food waste into the compost bins. 1/3 of residents who don't recycle don't do it because they don't know what's recyclable. 39 to 57% of residents want more information on recycling. So all this reminded me of a guy named Ray Ayer. I doubt anyone in the room remembers Ray. He was a longtime city employee who, maybe you do. Okay, well then, yeah, it's like a quarter century ago when Ray oversaw the recycling services of the city. He retired around 2006, and I knew him only slightly, but Ray was the person who invented Waste Watcher. And his feeling was recycling would never work without people knowing how to recycle and what to recycle. So he recruited a graphic artist, and correct me if I'm wrong in any of this history, but, and they put together the first edition and mailed it out to every city residence. And I think it was a big success. I think it worked, and city recycling really functioned well in those days. That was probably only one reason. Today, not so much is the impression I'm getting. And the survey points out a real gap in public education. Several years ago, someone in the city, and I don't know this history, I'm sure you do, decided that this shouldn't be mailed out anymore, and that instead the city would send a link via email to certain residents they had the email addresses for. Others could request this if they wanted a paper copy. I suspect the demand is low. And perhaps, maybe, this is part of the shortfall in public education that's going on right now. Maybe. I know going paperless is a fantastic goal, but maybe we should think again about mailing this out, a paper copy to residents. Especially given the fact that I heard for the first time tonight, maybe there's a glimmer of hope that the MRF could be up and running again sometime soon. You know, we don't want to wreck it again. Anecdotally, well, I'm kind of a snoop, and my neighbors will tell you this is true. And occasionally I look into the recycling bins of people around my neighborhood, and some things I've seen include garden hoses, styrofoam packing blocks, toner cartridges, shower curtains, plumbing fixtures, entire office chairs in a recycling bin. You know, Ann Arbor has joined the ranks, I think, of the wishful recyclers, you know, just toss it in and hope someone deals with it. And plastic bags. I think pretty much everyone throws plastic bags in their recycling bin. Just, again, this is anecdotal. And even with all this contamination, Ann Arbor's diversion rate still, I understand, trails the national average. So maybe it's a dumb idea, but I'm just throwing this out there. Maybe bring back Ray's original vision and send out something in paper to people. I don't think people check this online. I think if this is sitting next to the recycling bin in their home, they might actually do it. I do. So that's it. Thank you.
Thank you. We definitely share your concerns. All right. If there's nothing else, any more public comment? All right, we will adjourn the meeting at 9:27. Thanks, everyone.